Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
If you enjoy our show and you find our research interesting, please leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Something that small really does go a long way in helping us out. You can find more about us and the research that we do by heading over to Instagram and searching our name. As always, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's episode might seem like a strange one for us. Out of keeping with our usual style and subject type perhaps, but bear with us because we hope that once we share the bigger picture, then you will agree that the subject of tonight's show is a necessity for what is coming up over the next few weeks. To briefly recap, my team and I have just spent a short period of time over in the United States where we headed to meet with several individuals who we hope will give significant insight, experience, and witness to a selection of episodes that we have coming up on the horizon. We won't spoil what those episodes will be about just yet, but rest assured that we have some really exciting information and stories to share with you guys, and the next 2 months or so on Dead Souls are shaping up to be a hell of a roller coaster ride with some massive episodes and investigations. But while we compile all that we have learned, all of our investigative exploits, and while we structure our datasets, there first needs to be a short episode to lay out our stall, so to speak. And that is what tonight's episode is about. So, in tonight's show, we are going to attempt one of the following. Either remind and refresh you, or share detail and insight with you. You see, we need to talk about a time and a culture that doesn't exist anymore and hasn't existed for a long time. It's unlikely to ever return again either. Many of you listening out there may remember it, but many of you will have no point of comparison or understanding whatsoever regarding it. Some of you, even though you didn't directly experience it, might feel that you are entirely aware and know all there is about it due to its portrayal in the media and Hollywood. I'm talking about the period of the 1970s and 1980s. What the hell, you might think? That wasn't that long ago. Well, 1980 was almost 45 years ago. The 70s were 50 years ago. These times are half a century ago, and so much has changed within society, culture, family unit, technology, science, education, and just day-to-day life that it's almost staggering to think about for those who were actually there, both then and now. So much has changed slowly before our eyes that it's difficult to comprehend just how different the world was during those 2 decades, and understanding that is key for the journey we are about to embark on together. But it's imperative to comprehend the differences because understanding the zeitgeist from that period will play a highly important part in understanding the subjects and happenings that we are going to be sharing and talking about over the next few weeks. We're traveling back in time for a short while. For me, this is an important thing to bring to the surface. Sure, we all watch true crime documentaries and read stories of the paranormal, fringe science, and incidents out of the ordinary. But when we do, we view them through a current lens. Of course we do. It's only natural. Our mindset is in the present. The perspective we see the world from is with current knowledge and thought. But let's approach our next series of shows with something a little different. Let's put ourselves in that time. Let's do all that we can to be there. Think there and understand there, because in my view, it will make you see the outcomes and possible likelihoods in very different ways. It has certainly had that effect on me, and I hope to share that experience with you if you'll allow and join me, of course. This is Innocent and Dangerous Times. Growing up in the 70s and 80s. 40 years ago, the world was very different. MTV had recently emerged and was just catching on. The wooden Atari games console was very popular and a kind of novelty for many given its entirely new and modern experience of playing games electronically instead of physically. There wasn't any notion of a constant 24/7 news cycle providing us with minute-by-minute global news updates. Whilst this eventually emerged with CNN in June of 1980, it was still several years before the constant news phenomenon was absorbed into the common culture. Let's not forget that social media was not a thing at all. In In fact, neither was the internet. Most news came from a daily newspaper, if your family chose to purchase one, and most did. Your perception of global events was influenced by the opinion of the newspaper brand you chose to endorse. Tabloid media was a far stretch from the more highbrow and integrity-focused broadsheets, for example. Not that it was common for all the family to read the newspaper, though. It was usually a mum and dad kind of thing. Also, when I say global events, I refer to the minimal global events that the newspapers would share, with far more space within its pages dedicated to local and national news rather than international affairs. Of course, there was the nightly news on television. 30 minutes, fairly late at night, and this was probably a better source for international details should you have been interested. Already, just talking about news sources, it is becoming clear what that meant for the average person or kid growing up in that period. They were far, far less informed of societal, cultural, and political events. Compare that to kids and teens today who have access to multiple 24/7 news TV channels, political and cultural ads on their smart devices, news notifications on their phones, access to forums, blogs, social media opinions, and perhaps most of all, influencers. Essentially, social media and influencers of the 70s and 80s were your physical friend group. You were far more likely to have been quote-unquote influenced by the cool kid or kids in your high school than anyone else. Were there trends in magazines and on television? Sure, but I'd argue that local influence and cliques were far more influential on a young person's mind and opinion back then. Even more so, family. I mean, even if there was a particular actor or actress that you took particular note of and allowed yourself to be led by their thoughts, opinions, and practices, that still wouldn't have amounted to much given how access to them was significantly limited. No socials, remember. They might have a movie out once every year or two, or they may occasionally appear on a television show, but that was it. Their image, opinions, and information about them that got released to the public was carefully planned and cultivated to create the ideal PR image. A lot of it often pure horseshit built to create a positive image of them. The major Hollywood studios still controlled a large part of this right up until the early 80s, in fact. Celebrity scandals were far less common and significantly more hush-hush. Also, generally at this period, movies were also a strictly cinema experience. VCRs were brand new technology and still very expensive. They weren't commonplace until the mid to late 80s, so if you wanted to see a movie, you either paid to see it at the theatre or caught it on TV, usually late at night. On one of the 4 television channels that were available, channels where you had to watch what was on when it was on. No on-demand. Channels that rarely showed reruns either. Reruns didn't become a widespread thing until cable TV emerged in the late 80s. Essentially, until then, if you missed it when it was on TV, you'd be hard-pressed to see it again, so you better hope your friends saw it and could tell you what happened on your favourite TV show. So given how television was so basic, we often had to find other things to keep us occupied. Now this brings me to what is essentially, in my view, the summation of the period in a simple sentence. The 1970s and 1980s were essentially the end of innocence and the period of danger before safety arrived. Some of the things children and teenagers used to do at this time would probably get you arrested in today's standards. I'll explain what I mean by that.
So, safety standards in general were pretty absent in most instances of society. Take cars, for example. The regulations were more like mild suggestions rather than rules, guides, or laws. Nobody wore seatbelts. Many people wondered why they were even there. Those damned uncomfortable things. There were no airbags, no roll cages, no crumple zones, no ABS braking system, no cruise control, and no power steering. Cars were big, heavy, polluting steel boxes. As a kid, you could sit in the middle of the front bench seat if your car had one, and control the radio if your dad allowed it. If you wanted to see over the tall dash, then you could just simply stand up on the seat. Hell, how many of your dads let you sit on his lap to help him steer the car? Mine used to love to show me how he could drive the car with no hands, which is entirely safe in the 80s, of course. Also, how many of you remember when your dad used to take you and your siblings out, or you and a group of your friends? Kids just jam-packed into the back of a station wagon or a state car, or the bed of a pickup truck. Drop the parcel shelf and you can get a couple of kids in the boot, right? That's a trunk to my American friends. Car seats for young children were available to purchase, but did you ever see anyone actually use them? Did you see them in any cars? Nope, same. And talking about when your dad or your mum would take you out, how many of you remember going to the mall, supermarket, or other large store and your parents just leaving you all in the car while they went to shop? Just roll down a window and the kids will be fine for hours. I remember spending far too many Sunday afternoons laying on the back seat of my mother's car reading a comic book while she headed out to the shop and I just, hung out. We don't even allow people to do this to dogs anymore. It's not just cars though. The 70s and 80s were a time before there was any such thing as health and safety law. I mean, sure, the United States, United Kingdom and Canada all introduced health and safety in the workplace laws during the 1970s. But outside of the workplace, in day-to-day life for example, there was less focus on rules, regulations and safety, shall we say. Did this give way to a more carefree existence? Possibly. But then again, life expectancy was also far less at around 70 years of age on average, compared to today's 86 years of age. Maybe smoking had something to do with that though, because everyone smoked and smoked pretty much everywhere. Smoking at home, smoking in the workplace, in cinemas, on airplanes, while driving, in restaurants and in stores, literally everywhere. And people, smelled of it. Even children and the small minority of people who didn't smoke still generally smelled of smoke, as you couldn't bloody escape it. The convenience of cigarettes also allowed for it. You could buy cigarettes all over the place. Stores, pubs, takeout restaurants, gas or petrol stations, even vending machines. And yes, underage children and teenagers did use them to buy cigarettes and take up smoking far too young. Pre-safety, like I said. Not that vending machines were their only choice of scoring cigarettes though. Most stores would turn a blind eye to a teenager trying to buy cigarettes. Hell, in England, make that alcohol too. Hey, what's the worst that would happen if they sold booze or cigarettes to a kid, right? Well, literally nothing, which is the point. Vague guidance, not so much strict rules, or laws back then. Additionally, secondhand smoke was commonplace and something that everyone was happy to live with, or at least were oblivious to. And most people weren't even worried about exposing it to their children at all. Have you ever spoken to a baby boomer or Generation Xer and asked how old they were when they started smoking? How many times have they replied and said 10 or 11 years old? I know, right? Well, back in the day, and I remember doing this for family members of my own, parents and family could easily send a child to the store with a simple note asking the shop worker to sell you cigarettes or alcohol for them. There was never a problem, although there was a greater chance that the store clerk would actually know your parents or family members anyway, mainly because, community was an actual thing back then, and globalism just wasn't. Even if you lived in a large city, there were still block communities within city districts. Do any of you guys listening have children of your own? If you do, you will know the real fear of letting your children out of the house on their own, or even out of your sight in the current climate. Your children's lives are far more filled with activities now, or home-based things like video games, the internet, streaming and so on. This is probably where things are starkly different to the 1970s and 80s the most. Kids were very active, and it wasn't uncommon just to tell your parents that you were going outside to play and then disappear for most, if not all, of the day. Just be back home when the streetlights come on, right? That was very true and accurate for my childhood personally. On Saturdays, Sundays, and on school holidays, I would get up at 6 a.m. to get in an hour or two of the morning cartoons. Transformers, Dungeons and Dragons, He-Man, Ninja Turtles, The Real Ghostbusters and Thundercats. Then be out the door by 8 a.m, banging on the doors of all my friends. We'd usually end up heading home around 9 or 10 p.m, just in time for a quick bite that your mum had saved you from dinner, then to bed. It was always easy to tell where all the neighbourhood kids were just by glancing at someone's front garden or yard and seeing a collection of bicycles strewn everywhere. If you went around riding bikes, by the way, then you certainly didn't wear a helmet. Also, see skateboards, roller skates, and any other sport where safety equipment is now seen as a requirement. Americans, how often as a kid did you play no equipment football in the park? I bet it was brutal, but a hell of a good time. Big on the outdoors activity list for me was exploring abandoned buildings, the woods, the cliffs, the mountains. Ultimately, I guess I'm lucky I'm not one of the stories on Missing 411, right? But none of it seemed risky or extreme at the time. I also loved building dens, clubhouses, tree houses or hideouts, depending on what you call them where you lived. It was always a group activity that took serious amounts of planning and work, but it was so awesome when it was finished, and you and your group of friends would spend time in your very own secret hideaway. It wouldn't be uncommon to camp out there or someplace else too. Just tell your mom that you were staying at Josh's house. Josh will tell his mother that he's staying at Adam's, and Adam will tell his mum that he is staying at yours. A foolproof plan that was sure to trick the parents. Although, let's be honest, your parents really didn't give a shit anyway. You were out having fun. What could possibly go wrong, right? If you weren't camping out though, and you were just running late, and it was getting dark, then that too was no problem. You could literally find one of the many payphones that were all over the place and call your mum or dad to come and get you. There were no mobile phones after all. If they couldn't come and get you, or they were out when you called, no big deal, just thumb a ride or hitchhike back home. Dare I even say it, but if you didn't come home that night, the first assumption was really, oh, you must be staying at a friend's house. Kids and teenagers were freer, but this was due to a huge evolution that was happening to the nuclear family at the time. A change that was happening almost universally, but something that went relatively unnoticed as it was happening. You see, up until the 1970s, a woman's role in the family was fairly restricted and limited. Most women who were married, which was the standard back then, took on the role of the stereotypical housewife. But things changed dramatically in the 1970s, and millions upon millions of women entered the workforce. This coincided with the highest rate of divorce in history between the mid-1970s up until the end of the 1980s. This created a generation of what became known as latchkey kids. A kid who returns home to an empty house after school and who is often left at home with no adult supervision. This is likely due to their parents being at work. Often the older sibling will be left to look after or care for younger siblings, even though the older sibling is likely too young to be taking on this responsibility. I'm going to raise my hand on this one and admit that I was a latchkey kid myself. My grandmother used to make me wear a house key round my neck on a piece of string so I wouldn't lose it. Generally, my grandparents went to work an hour before I left for school and got home around 7 p.m, meaning that I was home alone from 3:30 until then. But I was always cool with the arrangement. Although, overall, there have been various studies to show the negative impact being a latchkey kid can have on the future of the child or children involved. Firstly, the effects of being a latchkey kid differ with age. Loneliness, fear, and boredom are the most common mental health factors that impact those younger than 10 years of age. By the early teens, there is an increased susceptibility to peer pressure, which could potentially result in behaviour along the lines of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, sexual promiscuity, and premature smoking. Common behaviours might stem from quote-unquote unspent energy, peer pressure to misbehave, and hostility due to the lack of appropriate adult attention. A 1993 Harvard study showed that preteen children left home alone for more than 3 hours a day reported notably higher risks of behavioural problems, higher rates of depression, and lower levels of self-esteem when compared to children with regular parental supervision later in life. I don't know about you, But doesn't this sum up Gen X and Millennial children perfectly? Physical punishment was also something that was viewed very differently. Smacking and hitting of children for misbehaving was commonplace and acceptable in society. Paddling or swats from parents or teachers was considered completely reasonable if the kids misbehaved or were disrespectful. Punishment was usually swift and painful. Corporal punishment, man. If you were a teenager in the 70s and 80s, then you didn't have Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or Snapchat. Your social media was hanging out at the mall, bowling alley, or shops with your friends. You could do a little shopping, though you didn't have to. You could grab something to eat, and a whole lot of hanging out. Parents would allow their kids to roam the malls all by themselves for hours and hours on end. Pre-arranged over the landline telephone with pinpoint timing. If you were late, then your friends wouldn't hang about, so you'd have to go find them. Text and cell phones weren't an option. Have you ever heard people say, quote, "Oh, people didn't have allergies, mental health problems, or neurodiverse factors back then," unquote? Whilst this is certainly an ignorant statement, as these issues have always been a real thing, diagnosis of these issues were significantly undiagnosed and untreated back in the 70s and 80s. Whilst a dyslexic kid in today's schooling would have their condition identified and receive appropriate support, back in 1980, that same kid would have to struggle in silence and likely end up acting out in school, with their education ultimately suffering immensely. Additionally, things like peanut allergies, for example, certainly were around then, but kids brought peanut butter sandwiches and peanut products to school regardless. Peanut and other allergy bans simply weren't a thing. In fact, EpiPens didn't hit the market until 1987, so if you did have an allergy, you just had to hope you didn't die and deal with it. Why didn't you hear about all the people suffering with these issues when you were younger? Dare I say, because the culture of bullying those who were different. Individual or unique traits weren't celebrated or supported. Differences were singled out negatively. Of course, I'm not insinuating that everyone was this way, though there was a cultural norm put to it. Here's a strange influence on the culture. Up until July the 1st, 1984, there was a huge gap between PG and R-rated movies, or if you were in the UK, PG and 18 certificate movies. If you take a look back at the movie Airplane, for example, which was rated PG, you'll understand how wide this gap actually was. The movie was filled with a lot of adult humour and some nudity, but this was considered, from a rating perspective, family appropriate. How many of you as children or young teens watched violent action movies or gory horror flicks that you were way too young to see, yet no one seemed to care? Parents heading out for the night? They would happily rent you the latest 18 certificate slasher movie when you were just 11 years old and leave you alone to watch it. It's another example of how rules were lax and guidelines ignored in comparison to today's standards. In turn, how do you think children having access to such media and age-inappropriate movies affected their psyche, the culture, and the collective societal perception? That was in the air in the 70s and 80s. You see, over the last 40 years, there have been many changes, not just in technology, but in regulations on what we can and cannot do. Most of the younger generations do not realize how many changes have taken place during the 80s and have continued to evolve and tighten. Freedoms lost? Perhaps, although traded for a safer society. I'll let you decide which was better. Technology in the 70s and 80s was relatively simple and often bulky. It was perceived more of an occasional object for entertainment. For example, record players, VCRs, early games consoles, and if you were lucky, a Sony Walkman with headphones that were decades before noise cancellation was invented, meaning those around you could also listen to your tunes whether they wanted to or not. Many kids had a record player, along with a collection of 45 records to boot. Polaroid cameras were another cool item to have, and gave the time period a specific look, vibe, and feel looking back at the imagery captured. Does anyone remember the Panasonic AM/FM wrist radio? It made listening to music fashionable, though gimmicky, which was what technology essentially was back then, before it evolved into a lifestyle necessity for all ages in the 2000s. I have already mentioned that if you wanted to speak to someone, you either picked up the rotary phone, which was usually situated in the hallway of your parents' house or attached to the kitchen wall. You'd give your friends a call, or you went over to their house. That was literally it for arranging, well, anything really. Teenagers often talked for hours late at night on the phone and drove their parents mad with the phone bills, which weren't cheap in the 70s and 80s. Pen pals were also a thing, where you would write letters often to a friend somewhere else in the world and share life updates and details. Sometimes schools set you up with the contacts, or you could find people through magazines. The entire notion of pen pals essentially died the second email became commonplace in the mid-1990s. A 1970 summer weekend might consist of a family drive to your local ice cream shop for a tasty treat. On the way you would listen to the radio, or if you were really lucky, your dad had an 8-track player, though these didn't catch on as well in UK or Europe. No one ever argued over whose Spotify playlist would be heard though. You accepted life's limitations, but you didn't see them as restrictive. I guess you didn't know any better. If progress is considered better, of course. Sundays were always usually slow family-focused days. A lot of stores, services and places to go were closed on a Sunday, so you were limited to home-orientated fun or visits to extended family. For me, it was regular visits to my grandpa, where we'd watch The Wonder Years, Quantum Leap and Alf. Toys in the 70s and 80s had an element of danger, and that was okay. Parents didn't sue the manufacturer, but it did teach you how to be careful and think about what you were doing, especially with the possibility of burns from the easy bake oven, chemical burns or poisoning with chemistry sets, or a wood burning kit. Even lawn darts had the possibility of sending something sharp into you. But like I've already covered, most of the time, kids were just playing outside. The saying that children should be seen and not heard was very apparent during this time. Parents didn't care what kids were up to, and kids were happy to keep their parents out of their private lives. In fact, our parents wanted it that way too. It was the only time when they could enjoy some peace and quiet. These were usually their words, mind you, because let's be honest, they rarely saw you as a child. You were always out. Do you remember when the 10 o'clock news came on and they would remind the parents to check on their kids?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
Well, many parents didn't. Having a bike was also very important as a kid. It meant a little more freedom, and it could take you places further away. After all, you had total freedom because no one gave a shit about you. But what kid didn't have and love a little bit of danger in their lives? Although sometimes kids did read books too. Well, the smarter kids did. Books hadn't become extinct and replaced by the internet and social media just yet, which was a positive. When it was hot outside, there was nothing better than a refreshing garden hose, of course. But let's talk food. Cereals such as Fruit Loops, Frosties or Ricicles. American friends remember Captain Crunch and Cookie Crisp. An unhealthy bowl of sugar for breakfast was the choice of most children. Unless you had some Pop-Tarts, of course. I guess you could grab that and head out the door to play with your friends. TV dinners, microwave easy meals, and quickly made noodles became a staple throughout the 1980s too. People were busy. Convenience was king. Healthy certainly wasn't. Nutrition over the years has changed a lot. We weren't trying to eat unhealthy, but we did the best with what we had. The crazy thing was that people seemed to be thinner, and perhaps because they were outside and more active, that it balanced things out, eh? I recently asked a friend of mine, who was born in the early 1970s, to sum up her childhood in a single sentence. She said, quote,
"We played in the dirt and never got sick. We were free, happy and had nothing, but at the same time we wanted for nothing."
I realised right away what she meant by the last part of her comment. We had nothing and wanted for nothing. The 70s was a time before consumerism took its hold on culture, thanks to the likes of Reagan and Thatcher. Slowly, throughout the 1980s, it became important to own stuff. Things you didn't need, status symbols, objects of desire that you could live without entirely. Now, of course, we all have houses full of crap and long for items that mean nothing to our lives. Look at the shiny. I think the hardest thing to convey to the children in my life about my own childhood is the concept of unadulterated freedom. As people who have been scheduled and monitored down to the second for most of their lives, they truly cannot conceive of life outside of the panopticon of their own experience. When I was a child, a successful day was one where I saw my mother for around 2 hours total, split evenly before and after she went to work. Helicopter parents were born in the 1980s, a direct response to their personal experience of being roundly ignored by their own parents. The 1980s were a decade of neglect, and I haven't felt freedom or terror like it since. Parents worked all day or had household chores that we never were privy to while we were in school. The further out of the way we were, the better. We formed friendships out of necessity, banding together for survival. With our only company being other children, we quickly became accustomed to a more feral way of life. For some reason, as a kid, I was obsessed with fire, with burning stuff. That wasn't dangerous at all. Mum never said a single word when I came home with a blackened face and smelling of smoke, however. Crime back then was a bit of a grey area. There were laws, yes, just like today, most of which are the same laws then than we have now. There were also police and various government agencies. But again, with technology being limited, the 70s and 80s and its unique culture also give way to the golden age of crime, cults and serial killers. At the start of the 1970s, criminals were king. By 1990, it was all over. But how many throughout the 70s and 80s got caught on the wrong side of it all? In 1980, no one knew what a paedophile was. But by the middle of the decade, stranger danger was emerging in the common vernacular. In the late 70s, policing was still so primitive that serial killers taunted the authorities on a public platform and even in the media. The Zodiac Killer, the son of Sam. Freedom of everything also went to the extremes. So are our kids better off today than we were? All I know is that I wouldn't trade my childhood for all the likes on Instagram. Some things are irreplaceable, and the memories of the 70s and 80s will always be something unique and important. But for us now, know that all these things went together with a million other things to encapsulate a period in time when things were specifically and uniquely then. Never like before and never like after. And with all of that, also came its unique issues and dark side. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.